What are the differences between fishing high floats and low floats? When is it suitable to fish high floats? Fishing with floats is all about adjusting sensitivity and finding the best setup for the type of fishing and fish you're targeting. The key to understanding float adjustments lies in the weight of the bait and the fishing depth. This article breaks down when to use high floats versus low floats and helps you make the right choice depending on your fishing conditions. 1. Sensitivity and insensitivity. How float adjustments affect your setup. One of the primary factors in adjusting your float is sensitivity. Sensitivity refers to how easily you can detect bites, which is determined by the position of the bait and how the float behaves in the water. Low-depth fishing. If you fish with a low depth, the bait touches the bottom, and the float tip stays more upright. This setup is more sensitive and helps you spot small movements in the float, such as subtle bites, especially when fish bite lightly. High-depth fishing. With a higher fishing depth, the bait is suspended in the water, and the float is typically less sensitive. The float tip is exposed to greater water resistance and is less likely to show minor changes unless the fish bites strongly. Important consideration: the overall sensitivity isn't determined by the depth alone. Even at different depths, if the bait weight and float buoyancy are similar, the sensitivity difference becomes minimal. However, low-depth setups generally make it easier to spot small changes in float length because the float tip is more submerged and less prone to interference. 2. Low depth versus high depth. Which is better for you? Choosing whether to fish with a low float or high float is primarily based on your fishing environment and the bite pattern you're expecting. Low depth fishing, more common and easier to read. Why it's popular: most anglers prefer fishing with a low float because the changes in the float's length are more noticeable, especially for light bites. This is particularly useful in winter fishing for species like crucian carp, where bites are often very light and subtle. Advantages: easier to detect subtle changes in float position. Ideal for still waters or calm conditions. Works well when the fish are feeding slowly or lightly. Disadvantages: wind and waves can interfere with the float's visibility. Shallow waters may not provide as much space for the bait to sink. High-depth fishing. When should you use it? Why it's needed: high-depth fishing is typically used when windy conditions make it difficult to spot changes in a low float or when you're targeting fish that feed actively. Advantages: better visibility in windy or wavy conditions, more of the float stays above water. Faster detection of active bites since the float settles quicker and more visibly. When to use high-depth fishing? Strong winds or waves, keeps more of the float exposed for easy visibility. Active bites, when fish are actively feeding, a higher float depth allows for quicker response to bites. Disadvantages: harder to read the float compared to low-depth fishing. The float can be more affected by wind and waves, leading to less accuracy in detecting bites. 3 key situations for high-depth fishing. While low-depth fishing works well in most cases, there are times when high-depth fishing is more advantageous. Windy conditions: if you're fishing in an area with strong winds, the low float will often be obstructed by waves. A high float will allow more of the float to stay exposed, ensuring that you can still spot bite signals clearly. Active bites: when bites are frequent and strong, a higher float can settle and turn faster, making it easier to detect active bites. This setup allows you to catch fish faster, as the float responds more quickly when a fish takes the bait. For smaller fish, if you're targeting small fish like crucian carp in fast-moving water, a higher float can help ensure the float remains more stable while you detect quicker bites. Adjusting the bait slightly can also help the float stand upright faster, helping you catch bites as soon as they happen. Final tips. Adjusting float sensitivity. If bites are light and you need maximum sensitivity, use slow-depth fishing where small movements in the float are easier to detect. Wind and wave conditions. If the conditions are windy, go for high-depth fishing so that more of your float stays visible above the water. Active bites. If you're in a situation where fish are biting strongly and frequently, opt for high-depth fishing to allow for quicker bite detection. About the author. I'm a self-media blogger dedicated to all things fishing, especially wild fishing and tactics for different conditions. Follow me to stay updated on the latest fishing tips, techniques, and advice. Like, save, and follow to never miss future updates.